Welcome to Min&JeanTV.
My name is Darcy Paquet. I do different work related to cinema, but most recently I did the subtitles for Parasite, and I also teach about cinema.
엄마, 짜파구리 할 줄 아시죠?
I was just sort of embarrassed because I made up this word,
Seems really
but it kind of works in the
soft-spoken.
film. Luckily, because first, this word comes out in the dialogue during a phone conversation.
Yeah.
And then, one character puts down the phone and says, "It's rammed on." And then, shortly later, as she's preparing the food, as she's boiling it, we see on the screen like the packages.
Yeah, the two different packages.
And so, even though it's not ramen and udon, I wrote ramen and udon over the thing so that people could understand that this was a word made by kind of sticking them both together. I did actually Google ramdon before writing it. It was like nothing.
Nothing.
It appears not to be a word in any language at all.
서울대학교 문서 위조학과 뭐 이런 거구나.
There are other examples like with Seoul National University. And the first time I did the translation, I did write out Seoul National University in the translation. We ultimately decided together to change it because it's a very funny line. And in order for humor to work, people need to understand it immediately. Whereas if there's an unfamiliar name of a university in the middle, then people have to stop and think more, and then the humor is kind of lost. And also, Seoul National University is very
outside
long.
of Korea might not
Oxford is
understand the
short.
significance of Seoul.
Always when you're doing subtitles, everything has to be so condensed. That's the biggest challenge, I think, in translating subtitles. I mean, there are a couple different reasons. I think that Harvard is sort of a too obvious choice. It's a bit more memorable if you say Oxford rather than Harvard, I think. And I think the story that it's telling is quite universal. So even if the details are very Korean, I think that this situation that it's describing, and the gap between the rich and the poor, the struggle that people face with inequality. I mean, this is something that not only in Korea but people all around the world are facing. So in that sense, I think that it was easy for an international audience to relate to. Again, it was put into a very Korean setting, but I think that was another thing that helped to kind of increase the popularity of the film, because those details are really interesting. And so, a lot of things like for example, the Jessica Jingle, which is becoming very popular right now. I mean, that's something that Korean audiences are quite familiar with.
Jessica
it was
Jingle?
new for international audiences, but they found it to be very unique and kind of refreshing.
When
so
the sister and brother
has helped the film, I think, in
rang
many
the
ways.
doorbell.
제시카 외동딸 일리노이 시카고 과선배는 김치모 그는 이사촌.
I mean, the way that it's executed on the screen is so beautifully done. I mean, the director is known for just being a perfectionist and being, just really incredible at the way that he executes certain scenes. And if you look at the scene, there's something quite fascinating in the acting and the movement on the screen. So that's part of it. And I think also that, I think because of the educational system in Korea and because of the Koreans are much more familiar with these kind of techniques. There are a lot of details that had a particular Korean element to them, so that in order to make them intelligible and to make them entertaining for an international audience, we had to sometimes think of ways to include a bit of extra information, or on one hand you want a translation to be comfortable for the audience. You don't want to overload them with too much information. You always have to keep the translation very short. I mean, to be honest, that's the hardest thing about translating. I think that, in the media, a lot of people have focused on, particular choices for the translations that I did in the film. But to me, the biggest challenge was keeping the language short and very direct, and so that it could have an immediate emotional impact on the audience. That was really hard. 20 years ago, in 1999, not many people outside of Korea were familiar with the kinds of films that were made in Korea. You didn't have many Korean directors who were known internationally. And the changes came so quickly. I think in the early 2000s, it was really this sudden wave that spread around the world. And yet, I mean, there were a lot of challenges for the industry in that time. So the industry has developed a lot since then. Now I think we're reaching a point where it's not just, ardent cinephiles or people who have a particular connection to Korea or a particular interest in Asian cinema who are aware of Korean films. I think that it's starting to break more into the mainstream. And of course you have, phenomena like BTS and
Right.
others that is, really expanding kind of awareness of Korean pop culture in general. So, this year Parasite is emerging as, the work that really I think gets a lot of people's attention and maybe will focus them more towards Korean cinema. So hopefully the film industry will be able to build
Sure.
off of this momentum and continue it into the future with other films. There is a special feeling that you get from Korean films, and I felt it as soon as I came to Korea and I started watching a lot of films, but it took a long time for me to really describe it, I think. And I've felt this with other people as well, other people who live in other countries who have developed an interest in Korean cinema. They do feel that the energy in Korean cinema is somewhat different. I think part of this is kind of the emotional directness of the acting style, of the storytelling. There's, Korean storytelling and just Korean films in general rely less on irony, for example, than American films do. But there's because there is this intensity and directness in the way that the emotions are presented, I think that they leave a big impact. And people really do kind of notice Korean films as being somewhat different. And you can even feel that in working with him on the translation. I think, other directors, as they're in the process of making the film, they discover things, they make some changes along the way. I think with Bong Joon-ho, you get the sense that the film is already in his head from, before he even starts shooting it. And it's just the process of, getting it all together and assembling it. And so he's definitely, naturally gifted in filmmaking, down to the very smallest details. On the other hand, I think that, in his films, there's a combination of kind of social critique, and there's a serious element to his films, but there's also an element of fun. There's a real edge, kind of some black humor. I've been in a couple of movies, but the one that
Even
people
in the
remember me
clip,
from
there's definitely
is
edge.
called The Taste of Money.
돈의 맛.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And I play a very rich, slightly evil, scheming capitalist.
He's a
I would find it interesting either to produce a film or to write a screenplay.
It's a very different image, right?
There are a couple of projects I have in my
His
mind.
image and the character just
I haven't
from
been
that
able to
quick clip.
find enough time to really concentrate on those because my workload is so intense. But I'm hoping that in the next year or two, maybe I can make a bit of progress.
좋아요
구독
눌러
주세요.
지금요
지금 바로 눌러주십시오.
눌러주세요.
푸시 더 버튼.